I'll start with you, Miguel. How is UNDP leveraging innovative financing instruments, including insurance and capacity building initiatives to support the blue economy and coastal resilience?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank for the organizers for the invitation today. It's an honor to be here. Also so close to the Red Sea, where a lot of the inspiration around the work that we do is coming from. So from UNDP, and I may repeat a little bit what has been said already this morning, and I feel when we think around the sustainable development agenda, there's one element that for me it's extremely clear. Is the fact that no government in the world will be able to drive this on its own. And this means that we need to crowd in the private sector. We need to crowd in the civil society into this agenda. And one of the ways of crowding in the private sector certainly is going to be through financing, to figuring out how to allocate the resources into private initiatives that can make economic sense. So in terms of that, I think there's two elements that we like to think around. First of all, what needs to be financed? And what needs to be financed are either new activities that allow us to create this transformation into the blue and green economies. And on the other end, we need to understand what are the externalities, what is the value that all this nature provides to us. And I like to think of the example, for example, of the coral reefs and how the coral reefs support the fisheries, support the tourism industry, and all these other elements that turn around this that may also need sort of this financing. So when we think around this financing, what we have been seeing is that we need to start crowding, and there's I would say there's a lot of resources that are ready to be going to these initiatives, but somehow, first of all, we need to think around how to identify them and then how to provide them access to these financing mechanisms. And therefore, as we're thinking around financing, there's this idea around the de-risking, which is extremely important. Why? First of all, because if I were a fisherman that needs to adopt new technologies around nets and fishing techniques and so on, I'm a vulnerable person, and I need to take this financing decision, accessing a loan that will allow me then to access this new technology. I mean, if you needed to invest around 90% of your assets, or what you have, let's not speak technically here. If you need to invest 90% of what you have, would you do it if something goes wrong and you're going to lose everything that you have? Or would you just stick to the things that you have been doing the way you have been doing it without changing? And this brings this idea then of like, we need to help to de-risk this decision of taking this next step into my new way of doing my livelihood activity, but in a way that allows me to continue if something goes wrong. And this is the sort of where we see that insurance is needed, to de-risk, to take away this uncertainty from people's decisions into moving into these new activities and new segments. So this isn't like for me to access a loan. When it comes to financial institutions, what we are seeing is that despite there being plenty of funds and institutions that are trying to finance, there's no risk appetite for this bigger risk. Why? Because the risk of no payment back because something goes wrong is extremely high still when we're thinking around this transition to climate change, so to transition to a blue economy. Therefore, we also need to be thinking around this elements on like, how do we help the financial sector to think around the risks that are happening down there where the economic activity, down there where people are really creating the real change? And how can we then use this de-risking in order to trigger the financial flows that could be going to these different elements? So what we are seeing then is that the de-risking mechanisms, from my perspective, had three elements. First of all, we need to be protecting from the losses that could be going into the elements that we are investing into these new technologies, new mechanisms for livelihoods, and so on. We cannot put money where we know that we're maybe losing it. Then the second role of insurance could be around we need to use it as a way to trigger the financial resources that need to go where we want them to go. And this means that we need to then take away the risk. And finally, it is this idea of behavioral elements. Can we really help people to take these behavioral decisions about moving to change the way I do my livelihood, to change the way where I invest, where I need to invest, and drive this change. So from UNDP, we have been doing a couple of things. In terms of activating resources that work towards the blue economy, we have worked in countries like Indonesia, but also in regions like Latin America, trying to help to structure these blue bonds, which are pretty much mechanisms in which we're trying to go to the markets to get resources from private investors. And then the work where UNDP gets more interested is like, can we help to identify these projects, these initiatives, where these resources need to go? Can we work with the financial institutions that would be absorbing these resources that come from a bond issuance that is done in certain countries and channel those to the right private financial institutions, national public financial institutions, and also to the right kind of projects where these projects would be making a difference. So I think that's an interesting thing around thinking of blue bonds, of saying like, we need to tap where resources may be available, but we need to create channels or funnel these resources into the right kind of initiatives, into the right kind of institutions that would be driving this sort of elements. So I would say that's when it comes to the idea of blue financing. When it comes to the idea of insurance, I think we've been doing a couple of things that I think are extremely interesting, like what we've been doing, for example, in Indonesia, where we have been working with local authorities, but also with fisheries, with the tourism industry, in order to identify what is the positive impact of coral reefs in the local economy. Once we did that, we realized that hotels would have an interest in paying for this insurance to care for the reefs because their activity depends from the reefs. We see that fisheries also are very aware that they need to keep the reefs healthy because the amount of fish depends from the reefs being healthy. And finally, the local authorities also see the benefits because taxpayers' money in the local community is really much depending from the tourists that are coming to visit this sort of diving regions that we have in Indonesia. So based in organizing all this, we could call it local governance, we can figure out how to, first of all, organize all these different interests, because the fishermen have one agenda, the hotels have another agenda, the local communities may have another agenda, but they have a common dependency from this nature. So organizing this dependency from this nature allows us then to figure out how to work together with the insurance industry and design a parametric insurance product that will be creating a compensation mechanism when certain indicators around water temperatures, storms, and so on happen, to release resources to the fisheries, to the communities, to the hotels, to be able to take care of both the conservation of the reefs, but also of the creating a compensation for the different economic activities that would be suffering from these reefs. So, I mean, we think this idea is extremely interesting. Why? Because when we look at the Red Sea, we see a very similar situation where there's communities, economic activities that depend from these reefs that could benefit from these elements. And when we think around the Red Sea, we also, as we were sort of running our thinking around that, is like there's an extra risk around, for example, oil spills and how they could damage the reefs and how we could enable the resources that could prevent or like could allow us to respond to any damages happening from oil spills into the nature. So based on all these elements over the past year, and this is a rather new line of work for us, so there's been I wouldn't say a steep, but it's a very interesting learning process in which we have developed a guidance document, where we try to really take all the lessons that we have taken globally around all these sort of initiatives, where we try to identify how insurance can be developed in order to create these better compensation mechanisms that would allow both communities, governments, to benefit from financial resources that allow us to conserve and preserve nature, but also to create a mechanism for compensation for households.
As mentioned earlier, on this panel we have a diverse representation of government, development finance, insurance, science, and investment. From your respective perspectives, what do you see as the most critical enablers needed to advance this space? We spoke about private sector, but I think we can go a bit deeper than that. What specific actions, partnerships, or policy shifts are required to move from promising pilots to scale large-scale investable solutions for coastal and marine resilience?
Maybe I'll take the microphone first. I think one of the main challenges that we see is that I think the theory of saying we all need to work together, and governments and private sector and civil society, it is true, but from the public sector perspective, I believe we are still, and from the Undp perspective, we're still trying to change the frameworks and the policies that allows us to do certain elements. And I mean, and for me, the example, and it comes from the region, is in Jordan, where there used to be a compensation mechanism by the government, by Ministry of Agriculture, but that was not enabled by the law to be able to work with the private sector. So it still had, and the policy making that maybe dates from some decades ago, that the state had the obligation to create the resources, to create compensation mechanisms. And therefore, a great part of the work is to start reforming public policies, rewriting laws in order to bring the perspective of like, how can the government better work with the private sector, with the civil societies to carry a lot of this work. And we enable takaful into the public policies so that this kind of financial services can be integrated into a policy. So everything that from the public perspective that starts to redefine the collaboration among public, private sector, I think it's extremely necessary, enabling that. I think the other element is on the regulatory side of things. Sometimes many of the solutions that are coming from the private sector need to be properly regulated. And this comes from this idea on like how much, when you're working with the private sector, therefore you're gonna have different rules into figuring out from the public perspective on how will you be tendering certain elements with the private sector. What is the profitability of this kind of business? It's not like the private sector needs to lose money, but from the public perspective, there's going to be an element, and that requires for policymakers, for governments, to rethink a lot of the frameworks in which they're used to work, and rethink the way that they will be creating these bridges to tap into the capacities of the private sector, and in particular, in this case, I would say of the investors, of the financial industry, and how the financial industry can step in to start providing resources to many projects, to many elements, where initially you would have only thought that it is the public sector that is going to be pouring its resources into it.
Thank you, Miguel. I'll just continue with the mic flowing through to Dr. Ahmed.